Berlin, April 1945. Above ground, the German capital had become a wasteland of fire and rubble, every street corner echoing with the thunder of Soviet artillery. Yet, beneath the ruins, in a bunker carved deep into the earth, the most feared man in Europe spent his final hours, frail, trembling, and trapped by the very walls meant to protect him. The Führerbunker was not a fortress of command, but a tomb of delusion. Inside its damp, suffocating chambers, Hitler sat hunched over a map that no longer reflected reality. He issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, commanded counterattacks from soldiers who were already dead or captured. His once fiery speeches had shrunk into whispers of paranoia, laced with rage and despair. Whispers of betrayal spread through the bunker. Some generals quietly plotted surrender. Others prayed for a miracle that would never come. The atmosphere reeked not only of sweat and fear, but of gasoline. Barrels stacked in anticipation of the inevitable. Outside, the Red Army tightened its grip on Berlin street by street, while inside, loyalty fractured, alliances crumbled, and the illusion of Nazi invincibility collapsed. What happened in those last days remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries. Did Hitler truly end his life with a pistol shot? Did he swallow cyanide alongside Eva Braun? Or could the truth be darker, buried under layers of propaganda and secrecy? What is certain is that in the claustrophobic depths of the Führerbunker, the man who once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich confronted the finality of just a few hours. This is the story of Adolf Hitler's last days, a descent into paranoia, betrayal, and death at the heart of a dying empire. By April 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. What Adolf Hitler had promised as a 1,000-year empire was barely surviving its 12th. The vast territories conquered in blitzkrieg campaigns were lost one after another, and the map of Europe was closing in on Germany like a tightening noose. The dream of domination had turned into a nightmare of destruction. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. After years of brutal fighting, they had driven the Wehrmacht back across Poland and into the German heartland. With more than 2 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, Marshal Zhukov's forces launched the Battle of Berlin, the climactic assault designed to end Hitler's regime once and for all. The city shook under constant shell fire, entire districts leveled in a storm of iron and fire. Civilians, soldiers, and refugees huddled together in cellars, praying for survival as the Red Army advanced block by block. In the West, the situation was no less hopeless. American, British, and French armies had crossed the Rhine, sweeping across industrial centers and farmland alike. German units surrendered in droves, many preferring the mercy of the Western Allies to the vengeance of the Soviets. Even the once proud Wehrmacht had lost its cohesion, fighting in scattered pockets rather than coordinated armies. Germany was collapsing on both fronts, its defeat no longer a question of if, but only of when. The political landscape inside the Reich was equally shattered. Within Hitler's inner circle, loyalty was poisoned by fear and ambition. Heinrich Himmler, commander of the SS, sought to negotiate secretly with the Allies, offering Germany's surrender in exchange for his survival. Hermann Göring, long considered Hitler's designated successor, attempted to claim power while the Führer was still alive, a move that enraged Hitler and exposed the fractures in Nazi leadership. Even Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister who still spewed promises of victory, understood the end was imminent. What had once been a hierarchy bound by fanatic devotion had turned into a den of betrayal and desperation. For the people of Berlin, daily existence was apocalyptic. Food supplies had nearly vanished, electricity and running water failed, and disease spread among the ruins. Children of the Hitler Youth were handed rifles and sent into battle against Soviet tanks. The propaganda machine urged civilians to resist to the last, but the promise of salvation rang hollow in a city already drowned in fire and ash. For many, survival meant only prolonging inevitable death. At the center of this implosion lay the Führerbunker, a subterranean labyrinth beneath the Reich Chancellery. Built of thick concrete, its chambers were damp, claustrophobic, and poorly ventilated. What was once a symbol of security became a prison. Hitler and his closest aides lived in artificial light, disconnected from the outside world except through distorted reports of battles already lost. Time in the bunker did not follow the rhythm of days, but the drumbeat of impending collapse. Meetings filled with shouting, whispers of betrayal in the hallways, and the constant tremor of artillery overhead. This was no longer the world Hitler had envisioned at Nuremberg rallies or on the battlefields of Europe. This was the shattered husk of a Reich reduced to its dying breaths, with its leader confined underground, increasingly delusional, increasingly isolated, and increasingly aware that the end had come. The stage was set not only for the final collapse of Nazi Germany, but for one of the most infamous endings in modern history. Adolf Hitler in April 1945 was a man unrecognizable from the fiery orator who once mesmerized millions. Age and illness had eroded him. He was only 56, yet he appeared decades older. His frame stooped, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Years of stress, sleepless nights, and reported ailments such as Parkinson's disease had left him physically diminished. The dictator who once strutted across grand stages now shuffled slowly through the narrow corridors of his bunker, leaning on furniture for support. Psychologically, the change was even more striking. Hitler, who once radiated confidence and iron will, had descended into paranoia and despair. His rages grew shorter but more violent, directed at generals, staff officers, or even phantom enemies in his imagination. At times, he would fall into long silences, staring blankly at maps as if willing phantom armies to appear. His voice cracked when issuing commands, but he still clung to the illusion of control. To admit defeat, even privately, was unthinkable. Yet Hitler was not alone in this descent. Around him clustered a small circle of devoted followers, opportunists, and those simply too entangled to escape. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, remained by his side until the very end. She was only 33, a woman who had lived most of her adult life in the shadows of power, rarely acknowledged in public. In the bunker, she emerged more visibly, hosting small gatherings, offering smiles amid despair, and ultimately choosing loyalty in death over survival without him. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, was the other pillar of Hitler's final days. Fanatically devoted, Goebbels insisted that the struggle must continue to the last breath. He brought his wife, Magda, and their 6 young children into the bunker, sealing their fate with his own. His loyalty was both chilling and tragic. He knew Germany was finished, yet he preached resistance until the bitter end, condemning his own family in the process. There were also the military men. General Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl still appeared at meetings, attempting to give shape to Hitler's fantasies of counterattacks. They spoke of divisions that had been destroyed months earlier, of reinforcements that would never arrive. Whether out of fear or misplaced loyalty, they indulged Hitler's delusions even as reality rendered them absurd. Others, like General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defenses, tried to inject truth into the conversations but risked fury and dismissal with every word. Beyond the generals, there were secretaries, guards, and aides, ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary circumstances. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, recalled later how surreal those days felt. A strange mix of mundane routine, occasional laughter at dinner, and the ever-present knowledge that death was closing in. Some clung to loyalty, others to survival, but all were trapped in a sealed chamber of fear and inevitability. The bunker itself reinforced their psychological prison. Its narrow rooms fostered gossip and paranoia, every whisper magnified by concrete walls. Outside, Berlin was collapsing. Inside, time seemed frozen, measured not by clocks, but by artillery strikes overhead and Hitler's erratic moods. For many, there was no distinction between day and night, only the oppressive weight of waiting. In this world, Hitler remained the gravitational center. Despite his physical decline and crumbling authority, those around him revolved in his orbit. They feared him, pitied him, and in some cases still adored him. His charisma, though fading, retained enough force to command devotion, even in the face of disaster. And so they remained, an inner circle trapped with their leader in the depths of the Reich Chancellery, preparing to follow him into ruin. The final unraveling began in mid-April 1945 when the Soviet Red Army crossed the Oder River and launched its all-out assault on Berlin. Within days, the thunder of artillery could be heard clearly inside the Führerbunker. The ground shook constantly, dust falling from the ceilings as shells rained upon the city. It was then that Hitler finally accepted, though never publicly admitted, that Berlin itself would become the stage for his last stand. News from the front was devastating. The Ninth Army, once ordered to hold the line east of the city, had been shattered and encircled. The 12th Army, under General Walther Wenck, which Hitler insisted could rescue Berlin, was already retreating under Allied pressure from the west. Entire divisions that Hitler demanded in his situation, reports no longer existed. Yet, in the claustrophobic atmosphere of the bunker, he continued to issue commands as if the Reich still had the strength to fight back. The inciting spark came on April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday. Traditionally marked with parades and celebrations, this final birthday was different. In the devastated Chancellery garden above, artillery fire forced the small gathering indoors. Hitler appeared gaunt and trembling, barely able to lift his hand in salute. Generals and party officials who attended were stunned by his physical decline. For many, it was the moment they realized their Führer was no longer the man who had once led Germany to conquest. That same evening, Hitler made a fateful decision. He would not leave Berlin. Despite pleas from his staff to retreat south to Bavaria, where remnants of the Wehrmacht still fought, Hitler declared he would stay in the capital and either achieve victory or perish with it. This choice sealed the fate not only of himself, but of everyone trapped in the bunker with him. Within hours, evacuation orders were given to those not essential to his immediate circle. Some aides fled westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans. Others, however, stayed, bound by loyalty, fear, or a sense that their destiny was now entwined with Hitler's. For those who remained underground, there was no turning back. The moment Hitler refused to abandon Berlin marked the true beginning of the end. The city became both a battlefield and a coffin, and the bunker transformed into the stage where one of history's darkest finales would play out in claustrophobic detail. From this point forward, every decision made inside its walls would be measured in hours, not days. The days following Hitler's birthday marked the slow spiral into chaos inside the Führerbunker. Above ground, Soviet artillery turned Berlin into a smoking ruin. Below ground, the atmosphere grew increasingly surreal, caught between denial and desperation. The Führer still held daily conferences, poring over maps that bore no resemblance to reality, issuing orders to divisions that had ceased to exist. On April 21st, the thunder of Soviet guns grew so intense that the bunker's walls quivered. Reports confirmed that Red Army troops were breaching the outer districts of the city. Hitler erupted in fury, railing against his generals for their cowardice and incompetence. He insisted that General Wenck's 12th Army would turn east, smash through the Soviets, and relieve Berlin. No one in the room believed such a maneuver was possible, but no one dared challenge him outright. By April 22nd, his temper collapsed into despair. In one of his most infamous breakdowns, Hitler screamed at his staff that the war was lost, that he had been betrayed by his military and abandoned by fate. "The war is over," he declared. "I shall stay in Berlin and shoot myself." The room fell silent. For the first time, even his closest followers were forced to confront the inevitability of defeat. The bunker's atmosphere shifted from tense optimism to grim resignation. Yet routine persisted. Eva Braun tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, hosting small dinners in the evenings. Champagne was still poured, music occasionally played, and jokes were exchanged as if to hold back despair. But every conversation carried an undercurrent of doom. Secretaries remembered laughing one moment and weeping the next as artillery thundered relentlessly overhead. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, Berlin descended into a nightmare. Streets filled with rubble and bodies. Civilians wandered aimlessly, clutching bundles of belongings, while fires consumed entire blocks. Hitler Youth boys, armed with Panzerfausts, launched suicidal attacks on Soviet tanks. Mothers carried infants into cellars that offered no real protection. The city had become a graveyard in slow motion. Inside, paranoia deepened. News arrived that Heinrich Himmler had secretly attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies through a Swedish intermediary. When Hitler learned of this betrayal on April 28th, his fury was volcanic. Himmler, the architect of the SS and one of his most loyal lieutenants, was declared a traitor. Hitler raged that Himmler should be executed, though he was far beyond reach. This revelation reinforced Hitler's belief that loyalty had crumbled, leaving him isolated in his final hours. The same day brought another shock. A BBC broadcast reached the bunker, reporting that Himmler Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had sent a telegram suggesting that since Hitler was trapped in Berlin, Göring should assume leadership. Hitler responded with outrage, ordering Göring's arrest. The once powerful Reichsmarshal was disgraced, stripped of titles, and confined to his estate. Within days, the mighty pillars of Hitler's regime, Himmler and Göring, were reduced to betrayers in his eyes. Even as his empire dissolved, Hitler clung to ritual. On April 29th, in the dim hours of the morning, he finally married Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony inside the bunker. The event was both intimate and bizarre. The couple exchanged vows while Soviet shells shook the walls above. Witnesses later recalled Eva's calm composure, as though marriage had granted her the recognition she had long desired. For Hitler, it was a final gesture of control in a world slipping away. Soon after the wedding, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. In it, he railed against Jews and blamed his generals for Germany's downfall, still unwilling to accept responsibility. He appointed successors, though by then such proclamations carried no real meaning. The documents were typed by his secretary, Traudl Junge, and distributed to couriers who attempted to smuggle them out of the city through burning streets. Few would survive the attempt. As the hours passed, reality closed in. Soviet troops advanced to within blocks of the Reich Chancellery. The roar of tanks was audible from the bunker corridors. Hitler alternated between violent rants and eerie calm, speaking of suicide with chilling casualness. He tested cyanide capsules on his beloved dog Blondie to ensure their potency. When the animal collapsed instantly, those in the bunker understood that the end was imminent. On April 30th, the bunker entered its final chapter. Hitler ate a simple meal with Eva, then withdrew to his private quarters. Minutes later, a gunshot rang out. When aides entered, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa, a bullet wound in his temple, and Eva Braun lifeless beside him from cyanide. The dictator who had plunged the world into war was dead. Not on the battlefield, not before a tribunal, but in a concrete chamber beneath a ruined city. The reaction inside the bunker was a mixture of shock, sorrow, and grim relief. Joseph Goebbels, ever loyal, refused to leave. He declared that he and his family would remain in Berlin and share Hitler's fate. True to his word, the following day, he and Magda poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. The bunker was transformed into a mausoleum of fanatic devotion. Above ground, SS guards hurriedly carried Hitler's and Eva's bodies to the Chancellery garden. Doused in petrol, they were set aflame as artillery shells exploded nearby. The flames consumed them quickly, leaving behind only charred remains. Soviet soldiers would soon discover the site, but the identity of the ashes remained contested for years, fueling endless speculation about Hitler's true fate. Within hours of Hitler's death, those remaining in the bunker scattered. Some attempted to escape the encircled city, disguising themselves as civilians. A few managed to break through Soviet lines, though most were captured. The Führerbunker, once the center of Nazi power, fell silent, its walls now echoing only with the memory of the voices that had orchestrated destruction. The rising action of Hitler's final days was not marked by triumphs or victories, but by collapse, betrayal, and the grim rituals of death. The man who had once commanded continents ended his life in darkness, surrounded by ruins, abandoned by all but the most fanatical followers. The Reich that was supposed to last a millennium had burned out in less than a generation, leaving the world to sift through the ashes of its crimes and its lies. The climax of Hitler's final days was not a single moment, but a crescendo of despair and delusion echoing through the cramped corridors of the Führerbunker. By the last week of April 1945, the space had become a theater of the macabre, where every action, whether desperate or mundane, was framed by the certainty of death. The psychological atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler's collapse on April 22nd, when he screamed that the war was lost and that he would stay in Berlin to die, had shattered whatever illusions remained among his followers. Yet denial persisted. Maps were still spread out on tables. Orders were still given to phantom divisions. It was as if the bunker's inhabitants could not acknowledge that the Reich outside had already ceased to exist. The physical state of the Führer himself embodied the collapse. Witnesses described his gaunt face, his shaking hands, his diminished voice. At times, he muttered incoherently, lost in fantasies of armies that would never arrive. At other times, he erupted into volcanic rages, accusing his generals of treachery and his allies of betrayal. When word reached him of Himmler's secret attempt to negotiate with the Allies, his fury was almost inhuman. The man who once commanded millions was reduced to a paranoid figure lashing out at shadows. But the darkest elements lay not only in Hitler's decline, but in the choices of those around him. Joseph and Magda Goebbels transformed their loyalty into a grotesque sacrifice. Magda, torn between maternal love and fanatical devotion, drugged her 6 children and placed cyanide capsules in their mouths. The children, ranging from 4 to 12 years old, were put to bed as if for sleep, never to wake again. This act, carried out in the name of loyalty to Hitler, remains one of the most haunting symbols of the bunker's descent into madness. Elsewhere in the bunker, others faced their own decisions. Some, like Eva Braun, embraced death alongside Hitler, her marriage just a day old when she swallowed poison. Others attempted to escape, creeping through shattered streets under Soviet fire. Many were caught, executed, or dragged into captivity. The bunker became a crucible of choice: die with the Führer or gamble for survival in a city already reduced to ashes. The final hours of April 30th carried an almost ritualistic quality. Hitler and Eva withdrew to their private quarters after saying subdued farewells. Outside, the sound of artillery shook the walls, a reminder that Soviet soldiers were only meters away. Aides stood in tense silence until a single gunshot broke the air. When they entered, the spectacle was grim. Hitler slumped on a sofa, a pistol in his hand, a bullet through his temple. Eva Braun beside him, her lips blue from cyanide. The man who had demanded millions die for his cause could not face capture himself. What followed was equally shocking. Their bodies were rushed up the narrow stairwell to the Chancellery garden. Amid falling shells, SS guards placed them in a shallow crater, drenched them in petrol, and set them alight. The flames consumed them as the Reich they embodied disintegrated. Neighbors later recalled the acrid smell drifting through the air, mingling with the smoke of burning buildings. This hasty cremation, intended to deny the Soviets a trophy, ensured instead that Hitler's death would be shrouded in decades of rumor and conspiracy. The darkness of those final days lies not only in the deaths themselves, but in the grotesque juxtaposition of loyalty, delusion, and destruction. In one room, secretaries wept quietly. In another, generals argued over escape routes. In yet another, 6 children slept under poisoned blankets. Outside, the city burned, while inside, a world built on lies collapsed into a ritual of self-destruction. The Führerbunker was more than a physical shelter. It was the symbolic coffin of Nazi Germany. In those dimly lit chambers, the myth of the invincible Führer died alongside the man himself, leaving only ashes, silence, and the haunting question of how so many lives had been sacrificed to sustain a dream that ended in such a pitiful, horrifying finale. The death of Adolf Hitler on April 30th, 1945 did not bring clarity to those left behind in the bunker. It deepened the chaos. For years, the Führer's presence had defined their lives. With him gone, the Reich had no anchor, only fragments of authority and a city still under siege. The immediate aftermath was not liberation, but a grim vacuum filled with panic, despair, and desperate improvisation. Joseph Goebbels, now the highest-ranking Nazi official in Berlin, briefly assumed control. He informed the staff that Hitler had fallen as a soldier, though everyone knew the truth. His words carried little weight. No one believed Germany could continue the war. By then, Soviet tanks were grinding over the ruins of the Chancellery Garden. The end was only hours away. The mood inside the bunker grew unbearable. Hitler's suicide was followed by the quiet weeping of his secretaries, the hollow silence of aides staring at the floor, and the occasional hysterical outburst from those unwilling to accept reality. Above ground, the smell of burning bodies still lingered in the garden, while artillery shattered what remained of Berlin. Every passing minute reinforced the futility of staying underground. The Goebbels family's fate sealed the atmosphere in tragedy. On May 1st, Magda Goebbels, driven by a fanatical devotion to Hitler's vision, poisoned her 6 children in their sleep. That evening, she and Joseph walked outside and ended their lives as well. She by cyanide, he by gunshot. Their bodies were burned near the garden wall, but the horror of their decision reverberated through the bunker, leaving survivors shaken. Others searched for escape. Generals and aides organized small breakout groups, planning to flee through the ruins of Berlin under cover of night. Some disguised themselves in civilian clothing, others carried forged papers. A handful succeeded in reaching Western Allied lines, but most were captured by the Soviets, dragged into interrogation cells, or executed in the streets. The once mighty servants of the Reich were reduced to frightened fugitives stumbling through the rubble. In the bunker's final hours, the sense of doom was absolute. The corridors were littered with half-packed suitcases, discarded uniforms, and whispered farewells. Those who remained alive were haunted not only by the destruction outside, but by the knowledge that they had lived through history's darkest chapter, only to see it collapse in fire and poison. By May 2nd, Soviet troops had fully secured the Chancellery and stormed the bunker. The survivors were herded out into daylight, blinking at a world reduced to ashes. The Führerbunker, once the nerve center of Hitler's empire, fell silent. It was less a command post than a tomb, sealed by the choices made within its concrete walls, a place where loyalty became delusion, and where the dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended in a few final desperate days. The death of Adolf Hitler inside the Führerbunker marked not only the end of a man, but the collapse of an entire ideology. Yet, the echoes of those final days would resonate far beyond the ruins of Berlin. In the years that followed, Hitler's death became a symbol, a lesson, and inevitably, a breeding ground for myth. For the Allied powers, the confirmation of Hitler's demise was essential. It allowed them to declare the Third Reich defeated and the war in Europe over. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. But while Nazi Germany lay in ruins, the psychological scars endured. Millions of displaced persons wandered the continent. Cities smoldered. Concentration camps revealed horrors beyond imagination. Against that backdrop, Hitler's suicide was both a relief and a frustration. He had escaped earthly justice, denying the world the spectacle of a trial like those that would soon take place in Nuremberg. The Soviet Union seized upon his death as a propaganda tool. Although they recovered what they believed to be his remains, they shrouded the details in secrecy. For decades, conflicting reports emerged. Some Soviet officials suggested Hitler had not truly died, fueling speculation that he had fled to Argentina, Spain, or even Antarctica. These conspiracy theories, though unfounded, thrived in the shadows of the Cold War, where misinformation was a weapon as potent as any gun. In Germany itself, the Führerbunker became a paradoxical sight, at once infamous and invisible. The Allies demolished much of the Reich Chancellery and buried the bunker beneath rubble. In later decades, East Germany covered the site with apartment blocks and parking lots, determined to erase its memory. Yet the bunker lived on in the public imagination, a dark symbol of fanaticism and destruction. To this day, little remains of the actual structure, but its presence in history books and films has cemented it as a place of both fascination and horror. The legacy of Hitler's last days also shaped how the world remembers dictatorship. His decision to remain in Berlin until death transformed him, in the eyes of some followers, into a martyr figure. But for most, it revealed the emptiness of his ideology. A leader who demanded endless sacrifice from his people, yet chose a coward's death rather than face responsibility. That contrast has fueled countless debates about power, loyalty, and moral collapse. In cultural memory, the bunker has been reimagined in documentaries, novels, and films. From serious historical works to satirical portrayals, the story of Hitler's final hours continues to fascinate. Perhaps it is the combination of claustrophobia, betrayal, and inevitability that makes it so haunting. A regime that had terrorized millions ended not in triumphant last battles, but in dimly lit rooms with whispers, cyanide, and fire. On a broader scale, Hitler's death forced the world to confront the dangers of absolute power and ideological fanaticism. The Nuremberg trials, held months later, set precedents for international law, prosecuting those who carried out the crimes of the Reich. Yet the absence of Hitler in the courtroom was always felt. His suicide denied survivors the chance to see him answer for his crimes. That absence perhaps explains why conspiracy theories linger. Humanity struggles to accept that one of history's greatest monsters could end in such a pitiful, hidden way. Today, the Führerbunker stands as both a physical void and a moral one. It reminds us of how swiftly power can decay, how loyalty can become delusion, and how tyranny ends not in glory, but in ruin. The legacy of those last days is not just about the fall of Hitler, but about the enduring warning that his rise and fall provide. A Reich that promised eternity collapsed into ash and silence, leaving behind only lessons that history demands we never forget. The story of Adolf Hitler's final days is at once intimate and immense. In the suffocating corridors of the Führerbunker, we see not the image of a triumphant dictator, but of a man unraveling, consumed by paranoia, betrayed by his closest allies, and abandoned by the armies he once commanded. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended not with fanfare or glory, but with silence, poison, and fire. And yet, the echoes of that ending continue to reverberate. Hitler's suicide left behind questions that still linger. Was it an act of cowardice or consistency? Did he escape judgment, or did he trap himself in the very fate he always demanded of others? Death before surrender? The ambiguity of his final act has fueled speculation for generations, proof that even in death, he continues to haunt the modern world. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson lies not in how Hitler died, but in how he lived until the very end, clinging to delusion, demanding loyalty, and dragging others into destruction with him. The bunker was more than his tomb. It was the final mirror of his regime, a place where fanaticism suffocated reason, and where truth itself was buried under concrete and smoke. As we step back from those claustrophobic days in 1945, we are left with a stark reminder: tyrannies do not end neatly, nor do they vanish without scars. They collapse in chaos, leaving behind questions, myths, and the weight of history. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Führerbunker, that the world must continue asking how such power was ever allowed to rise, and whether humanity is capable of preventing it from rising again. The war ended, but the shadow of those last days still lingers,